I appreciate the very short introduction. I'm probably between you and a long-needed and long-deserved nap, so I'm going to try to be as brief as I can. But I encourage folks to stay after I give my short remarks for the next panel. I'm actually most excited for that panel. The majority of what I've heard today has been virtual, but this last discussion where we have a lot of up-and-comers in our community who have continued to deliver in organizing in many facets is really what I'm most excited about, and that's sort of what I want to focus on today. You know, we are incredibly blessed to have a community that, despite being spread out all across America's geography, is still very well connected. Most folks are simply a phone call away. That if I need to reach out to a fellow Yemeni American, it doesn't take much work in our circles of influence and connections before we find an individual that can help us organize or achieve or accomplish whatever we were trying to do. So how are we going to leverage that as a community? You know, being able to talk to somebody from Utah or Texas or Michigan, New York, California, or even West Virginia, how are we able to do that in a way that is conducive, that protects and continues to promote a safe, stable, and democratic Yemen? One that so many of us have a connection to, that so many of us would hope to return to visit extended family, or for some folks that want to go back and live in that country. So as we talk about the dire political, economic, and health consequences as a result of this war, we have to remember one thing. This is a purely man-made crisis. The hunger in Yemen is not a result of droughts or lack of ability to grow produce in a place like Somalia. The conflict in Yemen is not because of a long dynasty that is now beginning to topple. This is a direct man-made crisis. And while that is very frustrating because it is folks who have allowed this dire situation to happen, I view it as a point of hope, that this is something done by man. It can be undone, as we can see today, by many men and women in our community. So the question I always ask myself is, what role do Yemeni Americans play in this process? I'm a proud person, I'm a proud son of immigrants who grew up in the greatest country in the history of the world. A country that has afforded so many opportunities for myself and for my family and so many of you in this room. But what are we doing to translate that blessing and that incredible opportunity that we have had to grow up and work and prosper in the richest and most powerful country in the history of the world? For some here today, it's engaging with the Washington Center of Yemeni Studies. And this, for me, gives me incredible promise. This is the first significant institution that begins to take the information and data necessary to then demonstrate our ability to understand the issue and provide recommendations for folks who are in political power. The reality is this. I, working on the state level, can tell you from personal experience that I will never be an issue expert on every single issue that I deal with. But I'm going to be forced to deal with every single issue that comes my way. That is the nature of political office. You are the most hated person when something goes wrong, and you don't get much credit when something goes right, but you're still expected to make sure that the wrongs get turned into rights. So as somebody who understands sort of that nature of politics in the United States, I can tell you that it is incumbent on the folks that care most about the issue to step up and say, we will give you the information necessary to make the best decision for justice, no matter who or for it is against. I'll say that again. We, as organizers, as community members, of those who are impacted, have a responsibility to provide that information necessary so that elected officials and those in power can make an informed decision for greater justice, no matter who or for it is against. And that's a little uncomfortable. I know that oftentimes we, particularly in politics in this country, we seem to grow disconnected. And the Yemeni community is not immune from that crisis. A disconnection in our politics is why we have so many obsessions with what the political letter after your name is, and less so about what you stand for or what your story is. So while it's important to have our data, how can we bridge that disconnection, bring people together, and then leverage our lived experiences to do good work, to fight for a safe, democratic, and prosperous Yemen? And this organization is a good first step in that, but you can't convince people on data and facts alone. I can tell you right now that the war has resulted in 150,000 casualties and over 230,000 have died as a result of the malnutrition. But what do those numbers even mean? In the context of data coming in at us at the tap of a screen or at the dictation to a voice assistant, what does that actually mean when we share those numbers? A child dying every 6 minutes as a result of hunger. What do those numbers actually mean? We have become desensitized to data, and this is a byproduct of information overload all across the world. So beyond using data, we must emphasize the power of our stories. As I like to call it, anecdata, marrying the science and the facts with the anecdotes of our stories. I got to tell you, the way I have been able to garner so much support in my community is not telling folks that I'm a Yemeni American. The reality is Yemenis made up less than 10% of the entire voting base in my elections, despite having a much more significant population in that district, but that's an issue for another day. Let's talk about the power of story. When I tell folks that my father had an opportunity to either go to the KSA or the USA, he stuck with the U. And that was probably the best decision he'd ever made in his entire life. Was able to come into a country and went from stocking shelves at Woolworths to picking strawberries in California and settled down in the auto capital of the world. And he was provided an opportunity and a job that was able to give him this chance to raise 8 children in the best state in the Midwest, Michigan. And you can clap, but as Jeb Bush would say, but the real story here is nowhere else in the world is the story like my father's possible. And nowhere else in the world is a story of my mother's possible. She came into this country with 4 children, hadn't have to cut school at 4 years in the 3rd grade rather. Never got a chance to learn how to read and write beyond the 3rd grade. Yet I talk to her every day and we communicate mostly through WhatsApp voice notes because this is the power of technology. But to see her go, one of the most impactful moments for me was when I saw my mom with 12 masks over her face because she was scared of COVID, walk into the ballot box and bubble her son's name despite never had the chance to learn how to read every single name on a ballot. But she knew Abraham Aiyash, and she made sure to bubble that in a little darker than the rest of the names on the ballot. And then you talk about your lived experience. We grew up as a first Arab family in a predominantly black community. And I leveraged these experiences, having been arrested. Fun fact, I was arrested as a freshman in high school. And going to college, being the first person in my family to go away for school, all of these pinpoints in my life story allow me to color the picture of who I am as an American. And then I talk about the conflict in Yemen, one that has caused 2 of my grandparents to pass away. May God grant them paradise. They passed away because they didn't get access to the medical care that they needed as a result of the war. And while I'll never question God's wisdom in taking someone back to him, I will always wonder if the circumstances had been different, would the way they had left changed as well? Think about my uncle who was on a bus from the village to the city to grab groceries for the week when an airstrike hit the bus that he was in, killing him and several other young men and women on that bus. I think about my cousin, who was literally my age, that was impacted and hit by shrapnel from a bomb that ended up killing him. I think about my other cousin, a lot younger than me, who was murdered by the rebels. These are the stories that I use when I talk to our federal officials about the war and impact in Yemen. These are the stories that I bring up when I talk to my colleagues who say they only know Yemen from the Friends episode and from that salmon fishing movie that was a really terrible movie, and I don't encourage anybody to watch it. But these are the stories that I use when I talk to folks. I don't mention the thousands of people. I don't mention how many folks die. I don't mention how many need water and what the impact of money for food and infrastructure is necessary. We start with the power of our stories, because it is only then that those stories move. Now, how serious do stories make an impact, right? If I told you the percentage or the likelihood that you get struck by lightning is so small that it's nearly impossible, yet you have a friend or a cousin who was struck by lightning and murdered, or killed rather, because of the lightning strike, are you going to be less averse to being afraid of lightning because you know the story of someone who got struck by lightning, even though the data shows it is so statistically improbable that it does not impact you as much? Or are you going to say, if there's lightning, I'm never stepping out of this building because I have a friend who was killed by a lightning strike? The data shows that you're likely not going to die from it. But the story tells you, not so fast. I know somebody who knows somebody who got impacted by that lightning strike. So remember that as we continue the work of advocacy here in Washington, D.C. and back home. The next point, and probably the final point, is we as Yemeni Americans know the value of democracy. I definitely do. It's how I was able to get a job, elected into office through the power of democracy. Even though my chances of winning didn't make much sense, but because of the power of organizing and connecting with people and one person, one vote, that story was made possible because of the great American experiment. So as a Yemeni American, I know the value of democracy, and I'm sure every single person in this room feels the same way. So that being said, why, when we talk about the conflict of our ancestral land, we somehow forget that the basis of democracy is dialogue and disagreement? That if I have a different viewpoint on how to address the conflict, I'm automatically canceled out. That if I disagree with your perspective on the conflict or the war, you are someone who does not value human beings. You are someone who's an X or who's a Y. We have a responsibility to know the value of dialogue and disagreement is healthy and necessary to achieve solutions here in the United States, for us to advocate for those back in Yemen. So with that end, how are we leveraging that? And I'll use the old adage of thinking locally and acting globally. Everybody here acts and thinks and cares and is always concerned about Yemen. But what are we doing to translate that into our work locally? I'm going to go back to that point I said I wouldn't touch on because it's important. But I said less than 10% of the vote necessary for me to win my primary came from a Yemeni community that makes up almost 45% of the city that I live in. Now, and that point I bring up is important for us to recognize because, as Dr. Debbie mentioned, if we are not engaging in the very mechanism that allows us to advocate, then how do we expect our advocacy to move through that system? No one is going to fight for Yemen the way a Yemeni American will. As I always tell my nephews, you can't sit on your hands and then ask why you can't clap. You are literally in your way in that process. But it's not to say that all of a sudden we start engaging in our political system that the resolution will be there. This is a long, drawn-out issue. And we have a responsibility to build for that future. The future of a Yemen that is safe, that is democratic, and that is stable for those people. But part of building for a future is inheriting the past in the current moment. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that this current moment and the leadership around this issue is concerning. And the way we engage about this issue is disheartening. But this is a first glimmer of hope, I think, that allows us to say, we can get there. Maybe in our lifetime, maybe not. But we have a chance to move towards that opportunity to build a Yemen that is safe, that is democratic, that is stable, because it is advantageous for us as Americans, and it is the right thing to do for those living in those countries, in Yemen in particular. So I ask all of you to, as you walk out today after the youth dialogue, to really think about how we move out of our echo chambers in Yemen. I would say I've never seen so much fighting about things specifically related to intra-Yemeni conflicts in our communities. Who's going to go to what event, or who gets to be in charge of what institution. Channel that energy into doing the good work that the Washington Center and so many other advocates across this country are doing to engage with local and federal and state officials so that they know your story. Because your story is the best thing, is the best tool that you have to ensure that Yemen will once again be free, and that all those statistics did not appear for nothing. Thank you so much. God bless you, and appreciate you all for having me.